Hello, Editing Michael here. We had the enormous pleasure of getting to give a talk this past week at the local Corvallis Hewlett Packard campus. We were invited by a combination of their Next Gen Young Professionals group, along with their women's group, to give a presentation on the power of homeownership, and it was delightful and we appreciated the invite. What we didn't realize was that a few minutes into the presentation, someone was going to walk by the camera with a absolutely top secret Hewlett Packard ink cartridge on their clipboard while they were getting lunch. And security made us delete all of the main primary footage, the A-roll, as we call it. So we still want to make sure that the rest of the world gets to hear some of this information. So please think of this like a podcast kind of a talk, but know that we'll have all of the PowerPoint slides going in real time in case you'd like to follow along when there's something that piques your interest, since we do have things like number crunches that are happening on the screen. Thanks for joining.
A conversation we're calling The Dream Isn't Dead, Please Build Equity. We're real estate agents, and so the point of this is we want to get you thinking about home ownership and the power that it has, and cut through a little bit of the hype of what you're seeing in the media these days. So, is this an overly dramatic title? When I asked Noelle this the other day, she said,
yes.
Absolutely. And I was like, no, I didn't think it was. But what we're seeing on a daily basis for years on end are social media influencers and news headlines that are basically telling you the world's about to end. I'm sure you've all seen things like this, and we're not trying to rag on Graham Stefan. He's got an amazing channel. He's got 20 million followers, very successful, great. But let's think about what you're being presented with every time you open your phone. Good news doesn't sell. I think we're all very familiar with that concept at this point, right? So everything we see every day is always that the market's about to crash. The housing market is over. The dream is dead, which is why we've got that overly dramatic title. I want to challenge you to think that the housing market can't crash every year, right? It didn't crash in 2023. It didn't crash in 2024. It's already being said to crash in 2025. And this is not photoshopped. It's also being said to crash in 2026. These are real thumbnails. This is what you're seeing if you look at the news, or even worse, just open your phone. So is the dream really dead? We don't think so. And what we want to do today is give you a case to consider.
All right. So who are we? So this is Michael Krozlowski. My name is Noelle Moen, and we are real estate agents with Team K Realty here in Corvallis. We've helped move over 400 families into the area, which is unbelievable. We are unbelievably skilled as well. We have lots of training, and we've won a lot of awards.
We're super modest.
Very modest. We're also super loved by our clients. We have a whole separate YouTube channel, apart from our main YouTube channel, of just people who went on video to say how much they love us for our handcrafted real estate services here in the area.
Yeah. And so we like to cut through some of the hype there too, because basically in real estate, when you get licensed, they give you a pin that says you're number one, and we're not all the same.
Some liability disclosures here. Remember that this is for entertainment and informational purposes only. This is not to be considered investing, financial, tax, or legal advice. If you have questions about that, go and call those experts. This is also not a commitment to lend. We might discuss some interest rates and payment calculations, but they are not a quote on the interest rates. That's very important. We are also equal opportunity housing and lending. And also, please see the initial agency disclosure in the back of your folder for info on agency relationships in Oregon. Just like a doctor and a patient, you have certain roles and certain duties to each other. So please read that.
How many milligrams of melatonin would you qualify the agency disclosure?
500.
500.
Milligrams.
That's solid.
It's very solid. You're going to fall asleep very quickly.
So here's what we're going to discuss today, and this is going to be brief. I'm hoping that we get just a lot of time for questions afterwards. We're going to really just touch base on a sampling of things. This is an appetizer to real estate. You could do entire talks on any of these topics. We're going to touch base on what the markets. We'll talk a little bit about the power of home ownership as opposed to renting. And in the why own version of this, we'll touch base on concepts that we want to set the stage for, such as leverage and real estate being a hedge against inflation. We'll then take those concepts and show you a rent versus buy comparison that I think will be very insightful. And we'll talk about how stats can be misinterpreted. We'll go into a discussion about how most people confuse the concept of appreciation with being the same as return on investment, and that is not how real estate works at all for most buyers. And then we'll talk briefly about how the process actually works so that instead of just planting seeds about why you might want to consider homeownership, you'll actually know how to take action when you're ready. And then we'll wrap it up in the time that's remaining before questions with planting a seed, just an appetizer of a conversation about house hacking and return on investment using one of my rental properties as an example. So what this really is, it's the Olive Garden sampler trio, right? This is not a full-fledged conversation about any of these things. It's just giving you something to think about. And I hope that it'll be mission accomplished in that regard, because there's a lot to discuss and a lot to know. And we don't want you to fall asleep an hour in after having lunch. So Noelle's going to start it off for us and talk a little bit about what the market conditions are actually like, which is yet another topic that requires cutting through some of the hype and headlines to truly understand.
So we're first going to define some definitions here, which is what is a buyer's market? What is a seller's market? You may have heard these terms before, but let's just overview them. So a buyer's market is where there is quite a few homes for sale. Home prices are not increasing that much, and there are only a few buyers. So buyers have a lot more negotiations in terms of this market. That's why it's called a buyer's market. Seller's market, very different. So with the seller's market, there are fewer homes for sale and a whole bunch of buyers. So that usually increases dramatically the purchase price of a home. Right now, with our market here in Corvallis, as an example, we're in a little bit of a weird seller's market, is the best way to term it. There's very few homes, but there are very few buyers because of the current interest rates or the perceived interest rates at the moment. However, we're starting to see the seller's market become more strong again because we're seeing multiple offers once again. Now, they're not like 3 years ago where it was 10, 15 offers on a house and it's the immediate going in is $50K over asking. We're not seeing that as much, but we are starting to see those multiple offers again.
And I would say, I don't want to necessarily speak for everyone in the industry, we're in general happy that it's not like it was 3 years ago. It's more humane right now. In terms of interest rates, we need to rewrite the social narrative on what's happening with interest rates right now. I hope that's the right phrase to be using. What we hear people talk about all the time are how interest rates are at an all-time high, and that's just not the case. Interest rates are at an all-time average. Now, I'm not trying to placate and downplay the impact that elevated interest rates have when you simultaneously have elevated home values. It's hard to buy a house sometimes right now. Corvallis, Oregon especially, is a competitive, higher-priced market. Not trying to downplay that. But if you're thinking to yourself and telling yourself interest rates are at an all-time high, then you're gonna mess up your chances for success because that's just not the reality. So yes, interest rates are a lot higher than they were in 2020, 2021, when the Fed intentionally pushed them way down to stimulate the economy. Mission accomplished on that one. And now what the Fed has done is they've raised them back up a bit to rates along the lines of 6 and 7%, because we're not quoting an interest rate. And they've done that to quell inflation, which definitely happened while the interest rates were low because people were bidding the prices up. So it's still doable. And the numbers that you're going to see in both historic averages to make projections, and also my real life example are going to be way more similar than you might think, considering looking backwards and looking forwards at the same time are more apples to apples than you might expect, given home prices and interest rates being higher than you want them to be right now. But interest rates are not at an all-time high. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when people think interest rates are at an all-time high.
All right. So what we see time and time again is buyers are trying to time the market. And in the words of Warren Buffett over here, only an idiot tries to time the market. The reason for that is it's because there's a lot of shadow demand. As soon as interest rates go down, more buyers come up, and then those house prices go up as well. So what we advise our clients just over and over again is just buy the house that you can afford when you can afford it. That's the best way to do that than trying to time the market and then ending up having to pay more or lose out on the house that you actually wanted in the first place. Also, we can't even guarantee that the house you wanted is going to be on the market and available for you when the interest rates are at where you want them to be. So buy the house that you want that you can afford.
And that's always an underlying assumption that should be applicable in real estate, but is something that we constantly remind our clients. So trying to time the market, it's just not a very successful endeavor. We also want to make sure that you keep in mind, as we just install little snippets into your operating systems, that real estate isn't even just local, it's hyper-local, right? One of the things that we know our clients are being bombarded with on a daily basis are nationwide news headlines about what's happening in XYZ market, which isn't here necessarily. And you're also, if you're a normal person, I'm one of them in some ways, you take advice from like podcasts and influencers and stuff. I listen to podcasts all the time about real estate investing that say things like, oh, always make sure that you pay 15% less than the asking price on that next investment property. Here's how we're successful, blah, blah, blah. That does not set you up for success if it's not the market that you're actually operating in. So what we want to do is we want to help get our clients to be informed consumers in the market conditions that they're actually wanting to buy and sell in. And really what it comes down to is not what's happening nationwide, not even what's happening locally, but what's happening quite literally with the house over there on 123 Main Street that you want to buy when 5 other people fell in love with it and wrote offers as well. You know where this is going, right? If it's a competitive situation and you're taking advice from some podcast telling you to offer a low ball to some specific arbitrary percentage, you're not getting that house. And this is the kind of mindset that we need to make sure you have when you want to be competitive and taking action in a hyper-local market. Corvallis especially is a boutique market. It all comes down to what's happening right there with that house, not the overall stat for the past month that happens to include new construction or a tree farm. It just doesn't matter when you're buying that house right there. Now let's touch base on some of these concepts that are, again, just snippets. These are just appetizers. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of leverage, and then you'll see how this gets applied in some of the calculations we'll show you.
So one of the great things about real estate investing, or just even buying a home, is that you get to use other people's money. What does that mean? You are not personally putting in $500K into the house. Typically, you're just putting in the down payment. You know what? I'm going to include closing costs into that as well, and your inspection costs. That's it in terms of you being able to purchase the home. You are not personally putting in $500K. To add on to this, most people maybe live in their homes on average about 8 years, typically. Somebody is already fronting that money for you. You get to put it in and pay off that debt. But by then, you've gained equity in the home as well to be able to change into that next house, whether you've had a change in profession, you've had a family grow, or you need to move out of the area for other reasons. So it's really great to be able to use other people's money to be able to purchase this, and you're still gaining money in the process. You don't have a very similar situation of, hey, bank, can I take a loan out to take out some money in stocks, for example? That's not the case. This is a really great way to use people's money to leverage and then get more equity for yourselves.
And we'll show you a great example in a moment. We also want to just touch base, again, just appetizers here, just planting seeds on the concept of real estate being a hedge against inflation so that you're primed for seeing what's about to happen in the number crunch example.
All right. So going back into leveraging people's money, we're going into specifically one of the 8 wonders of the world, as Albert Einstein says. Compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. So if you notice down at the bottom of this graph here, that's your annual payment. By getting into a house, you are locking in your payment in perpetuity unless you refinance, which is great because then it's lower. As you're living in this home, your debt is going down, and if you've made a sound decision, your equity in the home is going up. So you're compounding your equity and gaining all of that wonderful compounded interest by gaining money in equity in a home. While somebody else who is just renting, during this time, your rent is going to increase. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Michael, but the landlord laws state that they can increase your payment up to 10%.
This year it's 10%.
This year.
Yeah. That's rent control, by the way. So if that sounds like a lot, we can have a like-minded conversation about the poor implementation of Senate Bill 608.
Meanwhile, a homeowner, that's pretty much locked. It may increase just a little bit due to taxes, property taxes, but it's not going to increase to 10% of that.
So you lock in your payment, and 10 years later, like our pal Al,
You're going to feel like a genius.
there you go. I'm sure you all know the person on your street. Maybe you are this person who has lived in their house just like forever. They were the first person who lived there when the neighborhood was developed, and they talk about how their monthly payment is like $700. Yeah, that. Lock in the payments. It's one of the wonders of the world. Let's actually dive into what we've teased a few times, one of the number crunches here. This is going to be a rent versus buy comparison. This is that legal size sheet that's folded in half. The numbers jump all over the place. We'll highlight them on the screen as we go. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to follow along very well, but you should know that we're borrowing a number crunch from someone else, and I'll explain in a moment. We're going to use a real life example here. This is actually a house that is literally for rent right now. I took this screenshot the other day. It's over on Hayes Avenue. I know the owner. I know the house. I've been in it. It's in great shape, and it is for rent right now, as you can see, for $2,700 a month. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to round things for the sake of simplicity. $2,700 a month. It is in really good shape on the inside. They did a great job updating the flooring, the paint. They knocked down walls to make it open concept, because everyone loves open concepts, right? Words we're not sick of in real estate. And they did painted cabinets and all that stuff. It's nicer than my house. So renting right now for $2,700 a month. If you want to rent this, let us know. We can put you in touch with the owner. And the number crunch that we're going to do is to give you an example of what if you rented this house versus what if you bought this house. So we're going to say, let's say you bought it for about $500K, which is maybe even a little bit generous right now, but that would make the number crunch that much more favorable to the renter, which, spoiler alert, it's not going to look that way. So the number crunch here is borrowed from a friend and I would say like team member in quotes of ours. This is Joshua Kittle. He's one of our favorite local mortgage brokers, and he is over at Cross Country Mortgage. He could not be here today. We usually do these talks together because he is giving a talk on the power of homeownership somewhere else right now. Joshua, when you see this on YouTube later, let me know if I messed it up or not. Keep in mind, another disclaimer again, that we are not quoting interest rates. We're not even loan officers. All right, so this is not a commitment to lend, all that good stuff. All right, so let's dive in. So this is going to be a 9-year comparison, and we're going to use a bunch of assumptions to try to make it very realistic. So we're going to say, okay, maybe we're buying this house for $500,000. We're all on the same page there. Great. And we're going to put in here an interest rate of about 7%. I shouldn't say about, 7%. You can see that number. And that's a very good ballpark interest rate right now. I do think that even this last week, we saw rates go a little bit lower. Fine. Great. Let's put 7% in and move on. We're going to do a very leveraged owner-occupied loan. This is going to be a small down payment. This is not someone walking in here with $500,000 in cash. This is someone like you or I who's got maybe like a first-time homebuyer down payment, 3% down, which would be $15,000. And you can do that if you're moving into the house. It's a misunderstanding a lot of people have about real estate. You don't need 20 or 25% down to get into a house. So 3% down payment. And we're going to use historical average appreciation gain, which apparently is 4.82%. I'm just going to call it about 4.8%. Remember that number. It's going to come up again later, okay? And on the renting side of this comparison, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the renter is starting off, of course, at $2,700 a month for this house. You saw the ad. And we're going to assume that the rent is going to increase at an average rate of about 4.5% every year. Again, that is less than half of what Oregon rent control would allow the property manager to do. So we're trying to use pretty realistic numbers here, and we'll see how it all shakes out. So on the bottom, again, it just jumps all over the place. Thank you for your patience there. On the bottom, we can see that you've got a year 1, year 5, and year 9 comparison. So at year 1, or instant 1, you've got this homeowner buying the place for $500K with a 3% down payment with today's interest rates, give or take, and their monthly payment is $4,200. So that's a lot. I've been in the house for a lot longer than that. My monthly payment is less. Interest rates are higher than they used to be. We're not discounting that. But we're going to compare that $4,200 a month to what the renter is paying as time goes by as well. The renter at the beginning is, big shock, about $2,700 a month if we round up, right? You saw the for rent ad. 5 years later, that renter could still very much make a case for, I'm getting out of this way ahead of the owner because my rent has gone up 4.5% every year. It's now $3,200 a month. But look at the number crunch here. If I had bought this place, I'd still be paying more than $1,000 a month. But we know that's not the whole picture, right? That's the point of this comparison. Year 9, those numbers have started to catch up to each other. And I want to remind you that the homeowner numbers are still basically about the same. Albert Einstein says, compound interest, eighth wonder of the world. That homeowner has locked in their payments. 9 years later, yes, it's a little bit higher. Taxes and insurance increase over time, but not the bulk of the payment, not the mortgage itself, the principal and the interest. That just stays the same. You lock it in and 9 years later, you feel like a genius. That renter's now at $3,800 a month, still perhaps making a case for, hey, I'm winning. I'm paying less than if I had bought the place. We know that's not the whole picture. Let's look at the rest of the picture. So the cash flow difference here is very hard to ignore. The owner paid $118,000 more than the renter in terms of the monthly cash flow in those 9 years. The renter probably didn't take that money and invest it, though. Usually that's not what happens. So now the real question that this begs is, what did the homeowner get for that $118,000 cash flow outlay? So if we look at the rest of the comparison, you can see that on the nice color chart part of the graph here, there's a couple years where that homeowner is not doing as well as the renter, admittedly, right? They haven't captured the appreciation game as time goes by, and they haven't paid off much of the loan yet. For a couple years, that renter is actually ahead of the game. But by the time 9 years is done, the homeowners paid $118,000 more, and they've realized a net gain of $176,000 on top of that. They got it all back, and then another $176,000. Let's see where that came from. So again, we're using really realistic and therefore fair assumptions here. So on the side of the homeowner, we said that they used a small down payment, 3% down payment, which is $15,000. This number crunch also factors in their closing costs, another $8,500 on top of there in the negative to the homeowner. And then it also says, if we're selling the house after 9 years, it costs money to sell the house. Let's put some real estate fees and closing costs in there too. In this case, another 5%. That is definitely variable, but it's a fair estimate for today. On the owner's side of things, if they sell that house that they lived in for those 9 years, they're also going to get some tax benefits. I'm not a CPA, I can't give you tax advice, but my understanding of the spreadsheet we're looking at is that the tax benefit in this case comes from money that they got to save by not having to pay capital gains taxes at the sale by being an owner occupant as opposed to an investment property. We've got market appreciation happening, which if I recall correctly, we said was going to be 4.82%. Okay, that number is still going to be important for a few minutes from now. So here's what that does. Albert Einstein, eighth wonder of the world, something like that, right? We start at 500K. When you snowball that at 4.8% appreciation every year for 9 years, that 500K house is now worth $763,000 9 years later. So you're starting to see some of the power of ownership here. But they were also paying down the loan in the process to the tune of almost $60,000. So yeah, they were $118,000 negative cash flow, but what they got for it was all of it back and another $176,000. And this is the power of home ownership. Now, we're not trying to say that everyone should be buying every time they go someplace. Home ownership has a place, renting has a place too. But if you're in a scenario where you know that, let's say your job is stable and you're going to be there for a really long time and you have the ability to purchase, this is why it's powerful to do. All right, let's talk a little bit about how stats can be misinterpreted here. And I love this kind of stuff, but I'm really nerdy, so I hope that you really enjoy what's about to happen here too. So most people confuse appreciation with return on investment. So ROI, return on investments, I'm sure you all know that, but anytime we have an acronym, it would be good to define it. So here's what most people do when they're talking about the return on investment that a homeowner would get, even though they're really just talking about the appreciation. They would put into a number crunch like calculator.net that you're starting off with a 500K house because that was the price of the house. They would then say, hey, it went up to 763K. And in this example, as we just saw, a 9-year comparison. If we look at the investment gain, therefore, that house went up $263,000 because that's how math works. It's going to get a little bit more fun later. That gives you an ROI, an overall return on investment of about 50%. Okay, don't really have context for these numbers yet. Let's look at what the annual ROI is. That's what matters, right? In this case, the annual ROI, 4.82%. I told you that number was going to come back, right? What was that number a few minutes ago? It was the appreciation, not the return on the investment. In that big rent versus buy comparison, what we used for historical average appreciation was 4.82%. Most people think that's the return on the investment of the homeowner. And it would be if the homeowner paid $500,000 in cash the day they bought the house. How many of us are doing that? Most of us not doing that. So they're confusing appreciation with return on investment, and they are not apples to apples. Let's look at the real ROI for this hypothetical, but then I'll show you one of mine. So what we really need to do here, if we're going to be fair, is say, how much did it cost that homeowner to buy? What was the acquisition cost? I told you it was a 3% down payment. That's $15,000. I later on showed you that they had buyer closing costs of $8,500. Their acquisition cost was not $500,000. It was $23,500. Now, here's where the math is going to look goofy. Bear with me for a second. If we're not paying cash for the house, this ROI calculator doesn't have two spots where we can put in appreciation gain separate from the debt payoff, the amortization gain. So what we have to do is we have to just use this to quickly back calculate to make the investment gain show up as $176,000. Okay, fine. We put in that 9 years that we're already familiar with, and it gives us an ROI of some stupidly high number, which is what often happens in real estate. And when we annualize that to provide context, it's still stupidly high. 27% annual ROI, because they started with 23 grand, not 500K, but they still got to capture all the appreciation and gains from an asset that had a sticker value of 500K, even though that's not the money they brought to the table. And that, I hope, really helps hammer home, all pun intended, why we're such advocates for ownership. And you can make it even more fun than this. In the time that's remaining, we'll dive into a little bit about how do you actually set yourself up for success. And then we'll use some time to go through an example ROI calculation on one of my investment properties, which will be great practice for me. Thank you for being a guinea pig. So that's where we're going with all this. Let's talk about how you can actually set yourself up for success as opposed to just going to a lunch presentation and being like, that was cool, right? So here's what normally happens. And then Noelle's going to tell us a better way. What normally happens, or rather, what we're afraid is going to happen to people, because it does, is that you're going to think, oh, I know some realtors, because who doesn't? And maybe you think, oh, I don't want to bug that agent I know or that agent that I just met at some amazing HP talk. Thank you again for having us. Because they just seemed really busy or whatever, and I just want to look at houses. So what people often do is they're like, let me just go on all these websites, because there's a lot of third-party websites with great map user interfaces. Start looking at some places, maybe click that button that says get more info, which should really just say danger, don't click this button. Because what happens often is people will end up connecting with some random online agent, or perhaps even worse, connecting with whoever happened to be on the other side of the phone number on a for sale sign for a house, and just totally screw up the whole process that could have been the best investment they'd ever made in their lives. We don't want that to be your story. Agency relationships, as Noelle's going to talk about in a moment, are very different than what you think they are. We don't want you accidentally getting married to a real estate agent that you didn't mean to get married to on paper, and then basically just watch someone else buy your dream house because you weren't ready to do it anyway. Because if that happens, then you're going to think a couple of things. You're going to think that real estate sucks, and you're going to think that real estate agents suck. And that's going to be really bad for your long-term prospective homeownership experience. So that's not what we want for you. Can you tell us how this should really go?
All right. How to actually succeed is not that overly complicated. Basically, reach out to an agent and team that you find trustworthy and talk with them, interview them, and then also start building up your team. What is that team? That's going to be your lender. That's going to be your inspector. That is going to be everybody a part of the process. And if you don't have those people already, talk with your agent, because they probably know people and will be able to connect you with them. Another thing is doing a home buying consultation. So that way you can easily avoid all the pitfalls. So during the home buying consultation, we go into a little bit more detail. We're going to answer all your questions that you may have throughout the process. We'll go over the purchasing process, and I'll even go and touch on it a little bit here on the next slide. We also discuss buyer representation. So back in August 2024, some rules changed, and now you have to, before you even see homes, is sign a buyer representation agreement. These agreements were already in place and being used by some agents. They're now mandatory. The biggest thing about signing those is to clarify how Michael and I get paid, for example. It also establishes that you are actually working with us, so that way you're not working with some random agent just showing you homes and then going to another agent and writing an offer. So it's really establishing those relationships as well. Next, also, we set up a market watch search during this meeting. So that way we can figure out, okay, what does the market look like for what you can afford? And then we can also talk about, okay, what's your lifestyle? What are you looking for in a home? And see how we can put that all together.
So it's not on the client to just randomly drive around looking for sale sign with balloons.
That's correct. We have a robot for that.
I had no idea.
All right. So we like to showcase the purchasing process in a couple different ways because we both have an education background. But we're going for simplicity, the visual. All right. On the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have stress and money. No idea why those are correlated at all. First part of the purchasing process is getting pre-approved. Some people, that stresses them out because they think it costs money. If you notice, there's no green line item there. It doesn't cost you money to get pre-approved. It just takes a little bit of time to get all your financial paperwork together, submit it to the loan officer, and then they can start crunching numbers for you. That's it. After that, hopefully you're meeting with us. We're having that home consult. We've answered all your questions, and we've given you the green light. Yes, let's go see homes. We get to do the wonderful process of going and seeing homes. I get to go through and showcase, look, this is a bad roof. Look, dog pee smells. Along with a host of other things as well. When we find that house that fits all the bills, we'll go over offer docs. Now, we always offer as well to make sure to go over offer docs ahead of time, so that way you have an idea of what you're signing in the first place, instead of, oh, hey, offers are due in an hour, and then you have dinner plans in half an hour, and then you're freaking out about what you just signed.
Most of our clients take us up on that. We invest a lot of time, sometimes before you ever even go see the first house, to set you up for success.
After that, and your offer is accepted, we get into several of the contingencies. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because we usually spend a plethora of time during the home buying consult going over these things. But one of the first contingencies is, of course, the inspection contingency. This is where we get the inspector over and we poke and prod the house to find if there are any major issues with the home. And if we didn't find that wormhole in the fridge going into another universe, congratulations, we move on to the next step, which is the appraisal. So the appraiser is going to come out and check out the worth of the home to justify to the bank to give you that money in the first place to buy the house in the process. After we've done all that, we've gotten all the green lights to clear for go. We are going to then meet with escrow. Escrow is this wonderful neutral third party that's holding on to the money during this entire process. And they're also helping with paperwork to make sure to transfer title over to you in the process. Once we have signed all of those wonderful papers before closing, we then wait one more day, typically, and then we get to do big high fives. I get to send a whole bunch of emojis as well when we've gotten the news that we've recorded, and then we get to give you keys to your new home and celebrate.
And we guide you through all this with way more detail, but at the end of the day, it's also not that complicated. You just saw the heavy hitter vocab terms right there. All right. In the time that's remaining, if you'd like to hear some more numbers before just going into questions, and we hope there's a lot of questions, we can stay for a while, I'd like to basically use you guys as practice run. So I started out as a real estate investor before I was ever a real estate agent. My story, long story short, is that I moved across the country to be a Corvallis public school teacher in 2008. Remember the economy back then? It was awesome. I was laid off promptly in 2009 during that first school year. So I'm a laid-off public school teacher whose wife started reading books about personal finance and realized that I needed to listen to her and do what some of these books said. And instead of buying a normal person house, what we did was we made our own subsidized housing by house hacking a duplex here in town. And that's going to be both what I'm going to share with you a little bit about today and also the subject of the book that I've been very slowly writing for years and will someday, hopefully this year, finally publish. So this is actually the first time I'm ever presenting on any actual numbers of mine, and you're the guinea pig. This is me just like socially proving that I've done something on this book. It says 75,000 words. My editor has told me to stop writing. And I mentioned this word house hacking, so let's define that. Noelle and her husband have actually been house hackers as well. House hacking is what the cool kids say these days. When you live in a house, that's you being the owner-occupant, but you also, at the same time, let's say rent out a bedroom, or maybe rent out a bunch of the bedrooms, or have some of the bedrooms be on Airbnb. So it's a combination of living in a house like a normal person while also turning it into some kind of investment income property. And house hacking is a very, I would say, exciting and viable alternative path to homeownership. Because when you're doing this, you have other people helping you sometimes qualify for the loan in the first place and also paying it off for you. And you can make money being a real estate investor without being a slumlord, but that's a whole nother talk. What my wife and I did was we house hacked a duplex. So a duplex, like this picture on the right, it's kind of two houses smushed together with a wall in between. We lived on one side, we rented out the other side. We lived in that particular property for something like 7 years. And I'm going to show you a few pictures even as we go. The beauty of all this is that you get to do an owner-occupied loan, right? If you're a real estate investor buying a house for other people to live in, you have to have a bunch of down payments. But if you're going to be a real estate purchaser who lives there or a house hacker who lives there, you can do a low down payment loan. You're going to live there. It's not an investment property, even if you're renting out some of it. There's low down payment loans like we used in the rent versus buy example that are 3% down, not 25% down. Really big pitfall to avoid there, right? A lot of people just assume you need a ton of money. So this is actually my first house/duplex. This is here in Corvallis. I lived there for about 7 years. You probably recognize it. It doesn't look like anything on the outside, and boy, I can tell you when we bought it, it didn't look like anything on the inside either. It's got a 4-bedroom house downstairs, and then a sort of detached like garage with a little mother-in-law apartment above it up top. And this is the 4-bedroom house down below. These are the original pictures from 2009. And the 4-bedroom house was actually, it was decent. We'll let slide that it was Eugene Ducks colors, but it was in decent shape. It just needed some fresh paint and stuff like that. So I'm going to show you this because I want to be realistic. Half this property was good to go. And then we go upstairs into the apartment above the garage. And the pictures up there looked pretty good. We'll have to somehow get up that completely not up to code steep staircase. And the pictures looked good. We were excited about this place. We got there. We were still excited about it, but let's disclose. The carpet was greasy to the touch. There were fleas jumping all out of it. It definitely needed to be repainted. Everything was super dated. It looked really cute. There was a person living in there very happily for a couple of years. And the bathroom, when I ended up getting keys and scrubbing the shower panels to clean it up, I scrubbed them so hard that they detached from the wall. So I think that can tell you just what the reality was behind this photo. You can also very clearly see condensation dripping down for years from the knotty pine wood paneling because there was no insulation behind it. So this was not like, oh, move-in ready, okay? And I'm showing you this because anytime we show you a place, you need to be realistic. There's going to be a million reasons not to buy it. And we want to be realistic about that, okay? Because, and I don't know if you're all engineers, and I really apologize for what I'm about to say. This is absolutely putting my foot in my mouth. I'm a guest at Hewlett Packard. I'm going to make fun of engineers. That's really dumb, but let's do it. We love our engineers. We have a lot of engineer clients. You tend to be very logically approaching these things, right? Very linear logical. We've got spreadsheets. I'm right there with you. We've got spreadsheets to say things like, okay, how much is it going to cost in the next 5 years to replace that roof and do this thing and do that? Pardon the overgeneralization, but there's always going to be reasons not to buy the house. And there's a lot of things that you can do pretty easily to get past some of those reasons. And often what we see, the point I'm getting at, is that we see people letting slide what could have been the best investment they've probably ever made just because it needed new gutters. We see buyers talking themselves out of a place that they want to do because they're afraid of spending the money, and we get that. So we are, in fact, also licensed pseudopsychologists, and we're here for you. Usually that gets more laughs. Okay. All right, so let's look at some numbers. So what we ended up doing, the plan was, let's not live in the 4-bedroom house downstairs. It'd be really cool. We'd have space. We'd feel super fancy. But financially, laid off school teacher. Let's live in this little apartment. We'll fix it up a little bit. We'll rent out the 4 bedrooms downstairs. This is 2010 by the time we actually closed and got to do that. And it was for sale for $245,000. Now, I know that you can't buy a house for that anymore. And if you're thinking that right now while being mad at me, you're proving the point that real estate can be a great hedge against inflation, right? Because we're about to look at an ROI calculation of this. I don't mind telling you that it took us a while to fix it up. We actually needed some help. We had good friends and family that helped us fix it up. So this is us camping out in the house downstairs, fully furnished, while we fixed up that apartment and got rid of all the things I just told you that were wrong and re-insulated and sealed up the insides of the walls and redid flooring for $2 a square foot, DIY from Home Depot. There's a lot of things you can do that aren't that hard or expensive to really make a place okay. We made it cute, awesome, Insta photo readies. Let's look at the numbers, because that's really the fun part. All right, so I'm going to try to go fast here because I want to honor your time and make sure we've got question time. So we bought this in 2010. The market conditions were very similar to what they were today, maybe worse, okay? And I want to hang a lantern on that because you probably think that the market was amazing when we did this, and it wasn't. Everyone was telling us not to do this. Everyone. The only people that were fans of this were the books we were reading and our amazing local real estate broker who helped us accomplish major life goals. But we didn't have people being like, oh yeah, you should totally do this. People were like, oh, you're crazy. You want to fix toilets? That was the narrative, and still is. It was on the market for a month. There was no bidding war. We lowballed them, got it for $10,000 less. That was the market at the time. Arbitrarily, I finished writing the rough draft of the book I mentioned 13.8 years later. That's the number crunch you're about to see. A little bit of time has gone by, probably makes the numbers even better. And the market value at the time that I finished writing that rough draft was $600K for this. So it had gone up quite a bit if we bought it for $235. All right, so again, we've got an F on here. This is not the accurate numbers, all right? We're going to intentionally mess this up because I want you to have an investor mindset by the time you leave here, even if we're just planting a seed. So what most people would do is they would say, all right, you bought a house for $235, it went up to $600K. Therefore, that gives you over the course of these 14 years, an investment gain of $365 because math. They're just subtracting what it's worth now from what it was when we bought it. But that's not the whole picture. That's going to give you an ROI of 155%. I don't know what that means. It's just a big number. Annually, 7%. Okay, cool. We do have context to compare that to. In the rent versus buy projection that we looked at, we were using a historical appreciation of 4.8%. Apparently, my real life property did quite a bit better than that, but not like twice as much. And this is 2010 to 2024, which has been regarded as some of the highest inflationary times that people have been in. That's the critique of my book when I show it to my beta readers. They're like, Michael, you did this during highly inflationary times. I'm like, yeah, but it's still not as much as you think. 7% doesn't sound that impressive, but we know this isn't the real picture because most people aren't buying in cash. Let's look at a real ROI. All right, so 2010 purchase date, $235K. You already saw most of these numbers. The acquisition cost, 3.5% down FHA loan. I did not have $250,000 to buy this house. My 3.5% down payment plus my closing costs, because I've still got all the records of all this stuff and spreadsheets going back that long, was $20K rounded up. I did not have $250,000 to buy this place. It was $20,000. It was the biggest check I'd ever written in my life. 14 years goes by. The market value as went up to $600K. And the mortgage balance at that moment was $185K we still owed. Now we're going to get into a real ROI calculation. And the reason, or rather the way that we got to that balance, and therefore also the equity position, is again combining the appreciation going up to $600K, but also simultaneously the mortgage balance being paid down. By the way, mostly from my renters, not from me, okay? And we give really good rental rates on our properties. Like we undercharge big time. So that equity position becomes $415K. And if we put these numbers into a spreadsheet, again, we've got to do something a little bit different because there's not two different spaces for appreciation and debt payoff at the same time. So we're just going to back calculate to make the return amount $415K. I may have messed this up, but the numbers all still end up being about the same. 14 years goes by. The ROI is 1,900%, stupidly high number. What does that mean? It ends up being 24% annual ROI. Hey, look at that. During really highly inflationary times, that still practically matches dollar per dollar what the historical average projection ends up being on that rent versus buy too, right? That rent versus buy was at 25 or 26%. And this is the power of not just real estate ownership, but leveraging other people's money, having it be a hedge against inflation, and in this case, throwing in a little dose of real estate investing too, because it wasn't even my wife and I that were paying this off during those 14 years. So what we hope this gives you is, again, just a sampler. We just want to plant some seeds and give you things to think about, because it's really worth considering owning a home or possibly house hacking to get into your first home and or investment property. And that's not what the news is going to be telling you right now. If we compare this to the historical S&P average in that exact same time frame, my ROI was literally twice what the stock market did. My retirement funds that I have, which you probably have something like that too, 401k, etc., they're doing literally half as well as what I'm doing for myself by being a real estate investor. And my number crunch that I just showed you doesn't even include the rental cash flow. It, of course, doesn't include the tax advantages. And it doesn't factor in what I could be doing with that equity and have done with it next, which is why there's a lot more to talk about. You can play Monopoly in real life. It's called a 1031 exchange. You can sell the little greenhouse, re-leverage the money, get a red apartment. You can pull money out by redoing the loan, which we've done. We literally made one of our properties spawn another one, pulled the money out and bought a whole nother property, just for the sake of planting a seed. If your acquisition cost from your own bank account is zero and you get return on that investment, what's your rate of return? It's infinite. Real estate lets you do that. I'm not recommending you should. Being highly leveraged is a little bit scary if you lose your job and still need to make that payment, but we want you to understand the concepts. There's something worth considering here. If you want to hear a little bit more about some of those mindsets, the left podcast is me being interviewed about being a real estate agent and investor. The one on the right is really more about being a real estate investor only. Both local podcast people. And that's been our talk. So we just wanted to give you the Olive Garden sample trio, and we'll leave you with a couple quick reminders.
If you want to go over to our wonderful Team K Realty YouTube channel, we actually have a much longer version of the talk that we just had today, back in 23, called The Sky Isn't Falling and There Is No Bubble. It's a 5-part series, so go ahead and watch that if you want to learn a little bit more, or you can contact us and we can start talking more. And if you want to be really speedy, boom, there's a schedule a conversation with us through this QR code.
And we hope that you'll do what all of our other clients do, which is connect way before you think you need to. We're not here to sell you a house. We're here to be trusted advisors and part of your financial team for life. So we don't care if you're going to buy a house next month or even this year. If you want to start the conversation, just get in touch. So thank you guys very much for having us.